The Brigham that I understand from the historical record would have ever done anything like that.
Why should we believe him on polygamy?
Do we think the Lord was involved in the restoration at all?
Let's actually learn the whole story, rather than picking random quotes, random flaws to make the point. All right, Dan, this is really exciting to have you come on. I've had a few requests from people watching Skeptics say, hey, you got to bring Dan Peterson on. He's working on some things. You know, you just had this movie come out that the Interpreter Foundation helped produce, and we have other things going on with Brigham Young. What's the interest in Brigham Young?
Well, we did a movie originally in 2021 called Witnesses, which was about the three witnesses, predominantly the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And that seemed a really important topic. I was beginning to pick up that many Latter-day Saints just didn't know how strong the witnesses were. I'd hear believing Latter-day Saints say, well, the witnesses never claimed to have actually seen anything with their actual eyes or to have held the plates in their literal hands. And they did, each of those, and repeatedly so throughout their lives. And I remember once asking some people to name the three witnesses, and they came up with Sidney Rigdon, Brigham Young, and I can't remember who else, Orson Pratt or somebody. And I thought, oh man, we're not telling the story well enough. This ought to be well known because it's pretty powerful evidence. And it's the only evidence, as I see it, the only evidence for the Book of Mormon, secular evidence, if you will, that was given to us by God himself. I mean, it's mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and in the Book of Mormon itself. And so the Lord obviously thinks this is important, so we probably should too. But we did that movie, and that kind of established, the way I look at it now, maybe constructing the logic in retrospect, that the first thing to be established is, do we think the Lord was involved in the restoration at all? Well, I think the single most powerful way of showing that he was is the witnesses. But then after that, you're still faced with a question. When Joseph Smith dies, suppose you've accepted Joseph, then the question is, but where does the restoration go from there? Does it go westward with the 12 and Brigham Young? Does it stay in the Midwest with eventually the Community of Christ? James J. Strang, was he the guy? And I was beginning to hear people say things, even sometimes members of the church. I had one come up to me and say, well, Brigham Young usurped the role. The 12, it was kind of an apostolic coup. But the Lord can work through evil people, and he did through Brigham Young. And I rebel against that. And I think, again, the story hasn't been told adequately. So we decided to do a film. The next, if you will, fork in the road was, to me, the question of where do you go with the restoration after Joseph? And so we wanted to talk about the succession crisis of 1844. And we followed up Witnesses originally with a documentary that we called Undaunted, Witnesses of the Book of Mormon, where we brought in talking heads, scholars and so on, to talk about the issues that we'd raised. We wanted to do the same thing with 6 Days in August, the theatrical film about Brigham Young and the succession. But documentaries don't really do that well. They certainly don't sell that well, and fewer people watch them. And so we thought, let's do something different. We won't even try to recoup our costs. So we just told people, we're going to, you give us money, it's not an investment, it's a donation. If we get anything back, it'll go to the next project. You'll never see it again, so just kiss it goodbye. But we decided to put these short documentary videos, which we're calling Becoming Brigham. We decided to put them up online for free and to put them in as many places as we can. Links to them, put them up everywhere, with the idea that we just want people to see them. So we've been producing them. We've done work on about 24 of them so far. Probably about half a dozen, maybe a dozen now, are finished, more or less. We'll start putting them up, I think, in October-ish, somewhere in there. The idea is we want to have enough in the can so that once we start putting them up every week, we don't ever have a gap. They just go up regularly every week. So we need a queue, of things waiting to go up. But that's what we're working on. And we've been interviewing LDS scholars. We've had remarkable cooperation lately from the Church Historical Department. They've really gotten on board and have said, we're enthusiastic about this. Here's some people you should interview from our team. Here's a room you can interview them in. Here's some additional subjects you might want to cover and things like that. So we're pretty thrilled. We've never had that kind of support from them before, and they volunteered it. I mean, they've said, "Look, we agree. Brigham has been thrown under the bus. We don't like it, and we want to correct the record."
What's the best book we have on Brigham Young today? What do you recommend?
Well, Leonard Arrington's biography is a great one in a lot of ways. I'm really fond of Eugene England's Brother Brigham because he gets the sense of who Brigham was as a man. And Gene England is remembered, I think, among those who do remember him as kind of a liberal gadfly in the church and so on. But as Brigham once said of Orson Pratt, if you cut him in pieces, every piece of him would cry out, "Mormonism is true." And I didn't realize this, but he got a lot of expert help. I interviewed Ron Esplin for our documentary. Ron is the authority on the succession crisis in 1844. And I mentioned my admiration for Gene England's book, and he says, "Oh yeah, I supplied a lot of research material for that, and a couple of other historians did too." So it's not just some random English professor, off the top of his head writing a biography about Brigham Young. This represents kind of the cumulative efforts of several historians at that point. So Gene had access to some really good material, and to me, he writes so well that he gives you a really good, approachable portrait of Brother Brigham.
Brother Brigham has been thrown under the bus.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of 6 days in August, you don't
Mm.
discuss all the things that we've been wrestling with
Right.
Brigham. We have issues of race starting in 1852. I mean, this is what people point to, right? They say race, teachings about Adam,
Right.
and teachings about violent rhetoric.
Right.
Violent rhetoric. These are the big three. And now we have people saying, well, if we can't trust him on these three, why should we believe him on polygamy?
Right.
But 6 days in August actually does spearhead some things that would surprise people about Brigham Young. And the one that gets me super excited is glossolalia, right? Speaking in tongues. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, people, the movie almost opens with a scene of Brigham Young speaking in tongues to a pair of oxen. And and people said, "Oh, you made that up." No, we did not. That's in the sources. And the other episodes, there are two others, I think, in the film of Brigham speaking in tongues. Those are all from the sources. We didn't make these things up. And to me, they're important because they show a side of Brigham that many people don't appreciate. The image of Brigham that I grew up with was that Brigham was the great colonizer, the great practical man of affairs. Not very spiritual, probably, but he was what the Lord needed at that time. Well, these early glimpses of Brigham show him to have been a deeply spiritual man. He's one of the first in the church to speak in tongues. And he does it in the presence of Joseph Smith. And Sidney Rigdon doesn't like it, but Joseph approves. And that's a dimension of Brigham that we just don't hear about much. But he was a visionary man. He was a man who believed in the gifts of the Spirit. And so I don't want to restrict him solely to being the really practical colonizer. He is that. He's great at it. And I don't know whether Joseph could have done it the way Brigham did. But that's not all Brigham is. How does the practical man of affairs spend his last nights in Nauvoo? Performing endowments and sealings in the Nauvoo temple. That's what he really cares about. He's not out there organizing the wagon trains and fixing wagon wheels. He's in the temple. And then some of his last actions in Utah just before his death, dedication of the St. George Temple, revising the endowment for use in the temple. He's really committed to that kind of thing and always is.
One of the lines people talk about the most that frustrates me is I don't think, I know Eugene is helping us
Yeah,
rethink about some of the language that George D. Watt uses
yeah,
to capture Brigham and how it's pulled out and extrapolated in the official journal discourses. He makes this comment that for me is obviously him sort of razzing his
yeah,
best friend, Heber C. Kimball, where he says, Heber's a real prophet. This guy can predict things. I'm a Yankee guesser. And we're
yeah.
supposed to take that seriously and think he's saying, oh, no, I'm not
Right,
a prophet, seer, and revelator, right? I don't,
right.
God doesn't talk to me.
I mean, he has a canonized revelation in the Doctrine and Covenants. I mean, it's not like he never claimed to have received revelation.
That's right. Revelations. I mean, we all know the Salt Lake Temple scene, right? I stand at this spot. Whenever I look at this space, the vision's renewed to me again. This is a very spiritual man.
And he spoke on the basis of experience, I think. He didn't often cite it. But for example, he gives these descriptions of what life will be in the spirit world. And I used to think, well, he's probably right, but he's extrapolating from his beliefs. No, I now think that he actually had a near-death experience. I think he'd been there, possibly during the Rocky Mountain fever that he had coming into the valley, or maybe a little bit before that. There's reason to believe that he actually knew whereof he spoke.
I love that. You're talking about the February 16th, 1847 vision, right? Where he sees Joseph and Joseph says, "It's not your time yet." I mean, it is a classic. He sees the structure of the priesthood on the other side of the veil. This is profound stuff. Are those the sort of topics that are going to come out in this Brigham series?
They will. We're going to be addressing all of the problematic issues, I think. Brigham Young and violence, Brigham Young and misogyny, Brigham Young and race, Brigham Young and slavery, and showing background history and so on. But addressing, as far as we can, just about every difficult issue that people bring up against him, with serious historians who've given this a lot of attention.
I really have a testimony of Brigham Young. I think they should have gone. I mean, I think God gets his way. He plans things. He's given my lineage another chance by teaching me the gospel. I mean, I think that's how this works. He, Jesus knows how to save, right? I'm not concerned about that. I really have a testimony of Brigham Young, but there's one thing. I don't think we need to
Right.
defend everything about people, right? I think Brigham had too many wives. I think 50 wives is too
Oh, I think
much.
it
What
may
do you
have been, and
think?
I think he thought so too. I think there were people who came to him and said, "My daughter hasn't gotten married, or she was married and divorced. Now there's no hope for her. Brigham, would you take her on?" I mean, the famous case of wife number 17, she was probably not wife number 17, but Anne Eliza Webb, or as Nibley liked to put it, Anne Eliza Webb D. Young Denning, because she was multiply married and divorced. Um, but the parents actually, the evidence seems to indicate the parents came to Brigham and said, would you please take her on? I mean, women in those days didn't have legal rights, very many. And so Brigham took her on and gave her legal status and gave her a farm to work on. She complains in her sensationalistic book after the fact, when she's trying to expose Brigham Young and the Mormons, that Brigham pursued her and lusted after her. But it's not consistent with the record that she then gives, that he put her out on an isolated farm and basically didn't pay much attention to her. I think it was sort of welfare in a way. I mean, he was saying, okay,
Mm,
okay, I am not actually romantically attracted to you particularly, but your parents have asked me, and your prospects are slim, and so here's a farm that you can work on and live on, and I'll visit every once in a while. But she complains about neglect, which is, if he's the satyr that she says he was earlier, is a little odd. And I think that may have happened in more than one case. And two, the idea was you had to be sealed. They didn't have the notion yet, not until Wilford Woodruff receives the revelation about extending our lines all the way back as far as we can. You had to be sealed to somebody. And Brigham Young's a pretty good prospect. He's president of the church. So get sealed to him, and you'll travel with him into the life to come. So I think he probably took on a lot of women. This makes it sound bad, but it almost as charity cases, or yeah, if you need some help, if you need to be sealed to somebody, yeah, I'll do it. And I'll give you a little livelihood and so on. But I can't imagine that he enjoyed having that many wives.
there's a topic that is particularly interesting, and I struggle with how to do this because I think there's something to it beyond just saying it's a mistake. And that's what Brigham Young taught about Adam's role as part of a divine council or God, right?
I don't know what to do with it myself, but I'll tell you a couple of odd things, one little story and then one personal experience. I remember once reading a book by an apostate ex-member of the church about the Adam God theory. And at an odd moment, I felt the stirrings of a testimony, a spiritual witness. but I wasn't quite sure what it was a spiritual witness to. I thought there is something in this. There is something in this that I'm not quite getting. I don't understand it. It doesn't jive with my understanding of the doctrine. But I'm not willing to just toss it as false. I'm just thinking there's something here that I don't get. And so, my feelings about Adam God are ambivalent. I keep thinking, no, no explanation that I've heard really does it for me. But it's not false. Something in there is true. And whether George Watt got the transcription wrong or something, I don't know. A lot hinges on the precise wording. And I don't know if we can always trust Brother Watt to supply that. And unfortunately, if I recall correctly, I think Legene has said that the original Pittman shorthand for the most famous Adam God talk is missing. So, yeah. So, but the other thing is an experience I had with Hugh Nibley. I remember once being invited by Hugh and Phyllis to drive him up with my friend Bill Hamlin, the late Bill Hamlin of the history department at BYU, to a fireside that he was going to give up in, oh, I don't know, the South Salt Lake Valley somewhere. And I thought, okay, Bill and I talked this over. We've heard that Hugh Nibley believes in Adam God. I'd heard that a lot. And so I thought, I'm going to ask him, what do you believe? And so we're driving back from the fireside, and I said, okay, Hugh, now that I have you in the car and you're trapped, I want to ask you, you believe in Adam God, don't you? Yes. And I said, so what do you understand by that? He said, I made a covenant with the Lord that I would not talk about this. And that's all he would say. And I said, oh, come on, we're in a private car. I mean, I'm not going to talk about it with anybody else. And even his wife was saying, oh, Hugh, tell him what you think. And he said, no, no, I made a vow and I'm going to keep my vow. And then he would say things like, look, we're going under a bridge. Just anything to change the topic. So I thought, oh, I am so frustrated here because I thought, here's someone who I'll bet has a handle on it or will come as close as anyone I know. And he wouldn't spill the beans. And so I'm still kind of in the dark. I keep having the sense that there's something to it, that Brigham wasn't simply wrong. But did he express it accurately? Do I understand it accurately? Has anybody? I just don't know.
I think that's good. This is one of those things. The current prophet determines what the
Yeah,
official doctrine of the church is. And so that
right,
doesn't encompass all truth. We continue to learn things. And so you and I don't get to
right,
pontificate on the
right.
groundbreaking doctrine that God
Yeah.
might
Well,
teach
and I
us.
appreciate Hugh's point of view. If I did come to what I think was a proper understanding of it that made sense for me, I still wouldn't preach it from the pulpit or teach it in gospel doctrine or, come follow me lessons. Uh, I don't
Right?
think I'm authorized to do that. And whatever little bit of light I can get for myself, that's great. But, uh, but I'm not the spokesman for the Lord. I'm not the president of the church.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. The We've had so much on the topic of
Yeah.
violence and Brigham Young. Um, Seems like most of our Rick Turley has kind of spearheaded this point in much the way Juanita Brooks or others did before, which is Brigham used violent rhetoric to get people in line to act like a Western cowboy, and it was
Hmm.
irresponsible at times, and it indirectly led
Right.
to some
Right.
actual terrible deeds.
Yeah, I think that's right. We interviewed Legene Carruth, and I just happened to have looked at some of the footage, and she says, "Look, Brigham spoke in hyperbole. He knew it. His audience knew it for the most part, and he did occasionally say, 'Look, I have one really unruly member. That's my tongue.'" And she tells a little anecdote of him. He says, "If you ever see me standing outside, just standing there," he says, "That's me trying to get control of myself." So he knew that he had a tendency to run off at the mouth. But what I've also heard from people who know his writing really well, including his personal letters and his interactions with ordinary saints, he could rail against sin in the most wild ways. But when the sinner actually was in his office, he was pastoral. He was kindly, trying to help them. And one of the suggestions we've gotten from the church historical department, which I'm really excited about, is they have a couple of scholars up there who are working on what will probably be a two-volume collection of Brigham's letters to the saints, just ordinary saints. And I love that. I really look forward to including that because they say this will show you a side of Brigham that most people aren't aware of. Not the authoritarian thundering from the pulpit, but the kindly president of the church who's trying to help somebody who's got a problem. And I remember reading Dean Jesse's collection years ago of Brigham's letters to his sons, which also shows a really different dimension of the man, as opposed to the public sermonizer. But another thing that I would recommend is that I think there are videos circulating of James Arrington's old one-man show, Here's Brother Brigham, I think it was called. And James Arrington was the son of Leonard, a biographer of Brigham Young, so he had access to a lot of good stuff. And the words in this are almost all Brigham's. And first of all, he's really funny. And yeah, well, there's one story that has always stuck in my memory of a woman who comes to Brigham, and her husband has been verbally abusing her. She's very upset. She comes to Brigham and says, what do I do? What do I do? Well, I mean, what kinds of things has he said to you? Well, she says, he told me to go to hell. What should I do? Brigham's response is, well, don't go. But he seems understanding, and that's Lejean's take. She says some of us have spent years with his letters and reading his actual words. You see him as a caring man, a kind man, very different from the image that he has. So I just think that's important. I asked her once, so Lejean, what is the biggest misrepresentation of Brigham Young? And she said, the Journal of Discourses. So she has a little rhyme about George Watt. I hope I can quote it without offending her, but I loved it. She says, there was a man named George Watt who could improve Brigham Young, so he thought. So he added things here and omitted things there, and his accuracy was not what it ought.
I love that. I've heard
Yeah,
Eugene share that several times over the years. It's pretty fun. Um, Brigham
yeah.
seemed to love Joseph.
If
Talk to me
there
about
is
that.
any single, I don't want to say passion. I know some people take that and run with it in the wrong way, but he was devoted to Joseph Smith in a remarkable way. His absolute bread and butter was to understand what Joseph wanted and to try to do it. And it's fitting that according to at least one source, his dying words were Joseph, 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 which were interestingly, I think, Emma Smith's dying words as well. And I've sometimes wondered, well, did Joseph come for them? Is that possible? But one of the things that bothers me about this idea that Brigham invented plural marriage is that I don't think the Brigham that I understand from the historical record would have ever done anything like that. He was trying as hard as he could to carry out Joseph's program. We show it in the film when Brigham and Wilford Woodruff and Heber C. Kimball and George A. Smith are in far west Missouri. And they're at considerable danger. The governor of Missouri has issued an extermination order. It's still in effect, and there are people there who would gladly put it into action. Um, but Brigham's feeling is, well, Joseph said we would start our mission to England from this place at the cornerstone of the Far West Temple, and we will do it. Now, I read that so-called prophecy, and I just think it's kind of instructions. It's not a prophecy. He could have gotten away without obeying it. But no, to Brigham, if Joseph said it, we will do it, no matter what we have to do to get there. And yeah, yeah. And they're going the opposite direction from England. They're going backwards to Missouri and into a dangerous, dangerous environment. But he is going to carry out what Joseph asked. And my interview with Ron Esplin was interesting. Ron said, if you look at the succession crisis in 1844 Nauvoo, there was only one group really that was seeking to carry out the entire program of Joseph Smith. All of the others, the group that eventually became the Community of Christ, the others, Strang wasn't on the horizon yet, but Sidney Rigdon, for example, they weren't on board fully. They didn't want the temple. They didn't like this. They didn't like that. And some of Joseph's plans were seemingly self-contradictory. We're going to finish the temple, then we're going to abandon it and go west. Well, there were people who said, let's do the one but not the other. Brigham and the 12 said, no, this is what Joseph wanted, and we will do both. And they did. So he said, if you wanted the program with Joseph to continue, they were your only choice, Brigham and the 12, because they were devoted to doing that. And so the idea that that Brigham rather, would willfully disobey the prophet or invent a revelation, place it in his mouth, that's inconsistent with everything we know about Brigham.
I just heard someone say this morning, though, that if there was really a revelation from Joseph, like section 132, Joseph should have presented it. It's unreasonable for me to say, I'm going to trust Brigham Young.
Well, I'm sure Joseph would have preferred to have lived longer and done that. He didn't get a chance. I don't think that he wasn't intending to do it at some point, but it fell to Brigham Young. Now, I should say, and I don't want to give away their thunder, but we have an interesting article that has just been submitted to Interpreter on Section 132 and its authorship and date, and I think that will be of great interest to people in this controversy. So I don't know what the timeline on that will be. Probably sometime later this year that it will appear.
Brigham Young, and some of my favorite quotes from him, he says, I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ and of Joseph Smith. To me, we had Matt Groh, Terrell Gibbons call Parley P. Pratt the Apostle Paul of Mormonism. To me, and I think most Latter-day Saints, he's our Apostle Peter, right? He's bringing us through. If I was going to X out Brigham Young's ministry and just get Joseph Smith from what was already published at the time, maybe what RLDS have, what do I lose?
Well, I've thought the thought experiment a couple of times. What would have happened if Sidney Rigdon had succeeded to the presidency of the church? I'm not sure we'd have temples or eternal marriage. We wouldn't have had plural marriage. That's certainly true. We might have ended up with just a kind of, in some ways, an eccentric form of Protestantism. And so Brigham Young is the one who solidifies Joseph's contributions, including the Nauvoo period, which was where it became really controversial, and makes sure that those last. And he solidifies and gives them organizational form. So I think we'd lose a lot. We'd be, a strange form of Protestantism with an extra book. But even with the RLDS, the Community of Christ, they've so devalued the Book of Mormon in a lot of ways that it hardly figures on the radar.
Brigham Young is a absolutely controversial man. Your point in this series, in this movie, is let's actually learn the whole story rather than picking random quotes, random flaws to make the point. Will you give me a closing words on this topic?
Yeah, I gave a presentation a short while ago at Fair on Brigham Young and slavery, and this was an eye-opener for me. I had thought, well, yes, Brigham said some things about race that make me cringe. There's no question about that. But I tried to show in that so did Abraham Lincoln, so did other people who were on the side of the angels in the 19th century for emancipation of slaves, but still, by 21st century standards, we would count racists. Brigham Young, we would say, was a racist. Very clearly, I don't deny that. But he was in good company. I think he was not that different from Abraham Lincoln in some regards, in terms of his views. And the worst evidence against him, the most damaging single thing, besides a few quotations, was his backing of this 1852 law allowing slavery in Utah. So I thought. It turns out it is not a slave law at all. At multiple points, it goes directly against the slave codes of the American South and ensures that slavery can't be perpetuated, that it can't be inherited by children of enslaved peoples, and so on. He was taking what was, at that point, the fairly, if you wanted to avoid abolition with the potential of civil war, which obviously actually happened, killing, 600 and some odd thousand people and injuring that many more and devastating much of the United States. If you wanted to avoid the extreme of abolition, but also do away with slavery, there was what they called gradual emancipation. And that's what Brigham Young clearly favored, explicitly favored. And in that, he was in line with the reformers in Indiana and Illinois who passed similar laws. So my thought is when you look at Brigham, when you look at him carefully, yes, he's a flawed human being. He's a man of the 19th century, born in 1801. He thinks differently than we do. He sees things differently. But he's not a bad man. He's a good man who's really trying his best. And I think you find that on issue after issue after issue. And that's the point that we're trying to make, I think, is that, yes, he was, I think, the Lord's choice to lead the church, but not just Brigham. It was about the 12, apostolic leadership in 1844. But he was the Lord's choice, and we don't have to be embarrassed by him. There's some things we'd say, well, gosh, I wish he'd sounded like a progressive 21st century guy. Well, nobody in that period did. So if you want
Right.
that, good luck. You won't find it.